This video is sponsored by War Thunder.
In 1945, just after the end of World War II, one of the biggest civil wars of the century started in China. On one side were the nationalists who were aligned with America, and on the other side were the communists. At that point, the nationalists had almost every advantage that you could imagine. It seemed almost certain that they would win. They controlled the vast majority of China, including the major cities. They also controlled the railways, giving them a big advantage in terms of resources and logistics. They also had a big numerical advantage over the communists. The nationalists had about 4 million troops, 4 times as many as the communists, who had about 1 million. If that wasn't enough, they also had much better equipment. The nationalists had modern artillery, tanks, and heavy machine guns. Much of it was high-quality modern equipment that had been supplied by America. The communists had nothing of the sort. They had almost no artillery or tanks, and their rifles were outdated. It was a similar story when it came to air and naval power. The nationalists had a small but relatively modern air force of American aircraft and even a rudimentary navy. The communists had nothing in terms of an air force or navy. It seemed that the communists were merely a bunch of guerrillas holed up in the impoverished parts of China and would quickly be wiped out. That is not what happened. After 4 years of fighting, the war was over, and it was the communists that had won. They had managed to take control of all of China, and the nationalists were forced to flee to Taiwan. So, how on earth did that happen? If the nationalists had so many huge advantages, how did they end up defeated? In this video, I'm going to answer all those questions. But first, let's have an overview of how it happened. The story of the Chinese Civil War. The Chinese Civil War after World War II was actually the second phase of a civil war that had started decades before. That means that to fully understand the context, we need to go much further back in time, to the beginning of the century. For most of China's history, it was an empire, but that collapsed in 1911 in what was known as the Xinhai Revolution. Following the fall of the empire, there was a power vacuum, and China became fragmented as regional warlords took power. There were numerous factions, all fighting with each other, but 2 of the most important were the communists, led by Mao Zedong, and the nationalists, led by Sun Yat-sen. Those 2 groups actually worked together for a time to defeat the warlords and unite the country. However, the alliance was short-lived as both factions wanted total control of all of China. That eventually culminated in a brutal purge in 1927. The leader of the nationalists, Chiang Kai-shek, ordered a massacre of thousands of communists in Shanghai. Chiang thought that he was eliminating the communists as a threat and that he wouldn't need to worry about them anymore. He couldn't have been more wrong. That massacre triggered the Chinese Civil War. Initially, it looked like Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists would win. Chiang and his forces came very close to wiping out the communists in the mid-1930s. The communists were surrounded and on the verge of being destroyed. However, they just about managed to escape the encirclement and embarked on a grueling retreat that has come to be known as the Long March. Over 2 years, the communists walked about 9,000 kilometers. Of the 70,000 communists that started the journey, only about 7,000 or 10% survived. At that point, the communists were all but defeated, and it looked like Chiang Kai-shek had won the civil war and would take control of China. It was then that the Chinese communists were actually saved by the most unlikely of saviors, Japan. Japan had been gradually expanding its empire throughout the 1930s. In 1931, it invaded Manchuria, and over the next few years, it continued to take more Chinese territory. It was able to do that because China was so weak from its civil war. Chiang Kai-shek had been employing a strategy of defeating the communists first, and once they were neutralized, he would fight the Japanese. However, as Japan was taking more and more territory, that strategy became extremely unpopular. Those surrounding Chiang wanted him to stop fighting the communists and focus on resisting the Japanese expansion. Eventually, Chiang was taken prisoner by his generals and forced to agree to ally with the communists against the Japanese. All-out war with Japan broke out only 8 months later when Japanese and Chinese troops began firing at each other in Beijing. The war against Japan would take 8 years and temporarily stop the Civil War as both factions focused on fighting the Japanese. Eventually, in 1945, Japan surrendered after America dropped nuclear bombs on 2 Japanese cities. After Japan's defeat, the fragile truce between the nationalists and the communists collapsed and the Civil War restarted. At that point, the map of China looked something like this. The majority of China, about 70 or 80%, was controlled by the nationalists. The main region that the communists controlled was Manchuria in the northeast of China. That area had been under Japanese control, but then in August of 1945, the Soviet Union invaded and took control of it. When the war was over, Manchuria was supposed to go to the nationalists. However, the Soviets actually allowed the communists to take control of it. That was incredibly good news for the communists. It gave them the area's industrial resources and the Japanese military equipment that had been left behind. The nationalists did manage to secure a few cities in Manchuria, including the capital, Mukden, but almost all of the countryside went to the communists. Now, it's important to point out that when the Second World War ended, the Chinese Civil War didn't actually restart immediately. Initially, there were some half-hearted attempts to negotiate a deal between the nationalists and the communists. There was some talk of creating a coalition government that would rule China for the next few years and supervise the reconstruction. In reality, neither side had much interest in that. Both of them wanted to rule all of China on their own, and so the negotiations quickly failed. Fighting began in the spring of 1946. In July, Chiang Kai-shek launched a major offensive in Manchuria, which was very successful. 1.6 million nationalist troops fought against 1 million communists and were able to take a lot of territory. Mao Zedong, the leader of the communists, knew that his army couldn't match the nationalists in a conventional war, so he adopted a strategy of guerrilla warfare. They used ambushes and hit-and-run attacks, which proved highly effective. In the first year of fighting, the nationalists lost about 1 million soldiers. With losses that high, Chiang wanted the war to end as fast as possible. He wanted to deliver a decisive blow to the communists, so he decided to attack their capital, Yan'an. If the communist capital fell, surely they would collapse and victory would be his. In March of 1947, a nationalist force of 150,000 men advanced on Yan'an and were able to capture it without resistance. Chiang Kai-shek declared that that was the beginning of the end of the war, and some foreign observers agreed. In fact, the capture of Yan'an didn't make any difference at all. It wasn't remotely important. The communists simply abandoned the city, allowing them to keep their forces intact. In fact, the loss of their capital was so inconsequential to the communists that they were actually in a position to launch a major offensive only 3 months later in June. About 100,000 communist troops launched a surprise attack in the Central Plains region in central China, and to the surprise of everyone, they achieved a major victory. The communists lost about 10,000 men, while the nationalists lost about 80,000. That offensive was a turning point in the war. It gave the communists a lot more territory from which to operate, and many of the peasants in the area signed up to fight for them. For the nationalists, it was a major blow to their morale. By that point, 1947, the two armies had become much closer in size. The exact numbers are impossible to know, but the communists likely numbered around 1.5 million compared to the nationalists' 2.5 million. That was a big change. At the beginning of the war, the communists had had about a quarter of what the nationalists had. The next major offensive of the war was by the communists in the winter of 1947. Their plan was to solidify their control over Manchuria, which would allow them to launch a larger offensive in the spring. However, they quickly realized that they had a lot of local support and that the nationalists were much weaker than they had thought. That led the communists to be much more ambitious with the offensive. In just 2 months, they managed to gain a huge amount of territory in Manchuria. The nationalists did retain control of some of the major cities, but they were now isolated from one another, as the communists controlled almost all of the countryside.
Before we continue, I'd like to tell you about the most comprehensive video combat game ever made, now available for free on PC, consoles, and mobile devices. War Thunder. In War Thunder, you take command of over 2,500 tanks, planes, helicopters, and ships from 10 major nations, ranging from biplanes and armored cars of the 1920s to the fighter jets and main battle tanks of today. Immerse yourself in the intense combat of War Thunder, where incredibly detailed vehicles, realistic graphics, and authentic sound effects place you right at the helm of the most powerful war machines of our time. The vehicles are modeled down to their individual components: engines, fuel tanks, weapons, and crew, all susceptible to damage. If a vehicle is destroyed, War Thunder shows you exactly what happens. In X-ray view, you can see precisely where the shell penetrated, which components were affected, and ultimately what destroyed the vehicle. Join a worldwide community of over 70 million players in epic PvP battles today and take part in the breathtaking experience that is War Thunder. There's simply no better game for fans of military history. War Thunder is available for free on PC, PlayStation, Xbox, and even mobile, so you can take the battlefield wherever you go. Use the links in the pinned comment to earn a limited time massive bonus pack available for new players and returning players who haven't played in the last 6 months on PC and consoles. You'll get access to multiple premium vehicles, the exclusive vehicle decor, Eagle of Valor, 100,000 silver lions, and 7 days of premium account time. The offer is available for a limited time only, so be quick and sign up today.
With the war starting to turn against him, Chiang Kai-shek realized that he needed to stabilize the economy and do a better job of governing. He implemented a series of reforms that he hoped would do just that. The reforms totally failed, as the nationalist government, the Kuomintang, was deeply corrupt and incompetent. Meanwhile, Mao Zedong, the leader of the communists, was planning his next move. In September of 1948, he launched a campaign to take the major cities in Manchuria that was still under nationalist control. The communists had about 700,000 troops, slightly more than the nationalists, who had 600,000. One of the most important battles was the Battle of Jinzhou, fought in October of 1948. Jinzhou was crucial for the nationalists because it served as a major transportation hub and base of operations. Nevertheless, the nationalists couldn't hold on to it, and after only 8 days, the city fell. After that, the fall of the capital, Mukden, was only a matter of time, and that happened 2 weeks later. The casualties for the nationalists were catastrophic. Their soldiers were cut off from the rest of China, so there was no way that they could retreat. Almost their entire army of over 500,000 was wiped out. After that enormous success, the communists didn't give the nationalists any time to recover. They launched another huge offensive, this time breaking out of Manchuria and into the Chinese heartland. The battle was absolutely enormous, with about 1 million soldiers from each side fighting along a front line that was about 200 kilometers. The communists' main target was Zhuzhou, far south of their stronghold in Manchuria. They encircled and besieged the city, which proved incredibly effective, and very quickly Zhuzhou began to run out of supplies. Chiang Kai-shek refused to evacuate the 200,000 defenders. He wanted to send reinforcements to break the siege, but every attempt failed. Eventually, after 2 months of grueling siege warfare, the communists launched a massive assault on the city and were able to take it. That was a catastrophe for the nationalists. They had lost not only a vital stronghold, but also a huge number of soldiers, many of whom were their best men. They were, by that point, close to collapse. Just a few weeks later, the communists took Beijing in the north. With defeat looking imminent, Chiang Kai-shek made one final attempt to negotiate with the communists, hoping to avoid a total defeat. The communists had no interest in making a deal, given that they were on the verge of victory. They continued to push south, and the nationalists were unable to put up much resistance. On April the 23rd, the communists took the nationalist capital Nanjing, effectively winning the war. For a while, the nationalists did keep on fighting, but it proved futile. Eventually, in December of 1949, they retreated to Taiwan, abandoning mainland China to the communists. Mao Zedong was left as the undisputed ruler of China. Over the next few decades, he would try to turn China into a communist utopia. That would lead to the biggest famine in human history, which killed over 50 million people. So, that is what happened. Against all odds, the Communist Party won the Civil War. The question then is, how did the communists do it? How is it that at the beginning of the war they were at a disadvantage in almost every imaginable way, and yet in the end they prevailed? I believe that there are two main factors to focus on. The first is that the communists were far more effective at winning over the support of the population. As the war went on, the communists became more and more popular, while the nationalists became more and more unpopular. So, what did the communists do to become so popular? The most important thing was their radical land redistribution policy. Essentially, what that was forcibly taking land from the landlords that were often hated and giving it to the peasants that had been working it. Needless to say, to receive a whole load of land from their former bosses that they had long resented was extremely popular with the peasants. The process looked something like this. Teams from the Communist Party would visit villages under their control and introduce them to communist ideas such as class warfare and revolution. The villagers would be propagandized to have as much resentment as possible towards the landlords. Then the land redistribution itself would happen. First, the Communist Party officials had to determine the village's hierarchy and work out who were the landlords and who were the peasants. Then, very violently, the landlords would be stripped of their land and possessions, and it would be given to the peasants. Often, the landlords were socially ostracized, beaten, or even killed. That happened on an enormous scale. By the end of 1947, over 25 million hectares of land had been given to about 20 million peasants. For reference, that is an area roughly equal to the total size of the United Kingdom. In terms of winning people over to the communist cause, the policy was genius. While the land confiscation obviously alienated the landlords, it won the love and support of the peasants, and of course there were far more peasants than there were landlords. One young American observer described the joy of the peasants. He wrote, "Young men and women in blue run back and forth, singing songs and talking of revolution." Aside from making the peasants like the communists, the policy also had another huge benefit. The peasants that had received land were now personally financially invested in the communists winning. In order for the peasants to be able to hold on to the land that they had just received, the communists needed to win the civil war. If the nationalists won, their village hierarchy would be returned to what it had been before, and they would have to give back the land to their former landlord. If they had committed violence or killed their former landlord, they might even face punishment. Needless to say, the peasants were determined for that not to happen, and so they needed the communists to win the civil war. As you can see, the policy was genius. It was the classic communist tactic of leveraging the resentment of the masses against the wealthy in order to win their support. The land redistribution policy was probably the biggest thing that made the communists popular, but there were others. Something else worth mentioning is that the communists treated their soldiers much better than the nationalists. Chiang Kai-shek was fairly wasteful with his troops. He didn't care much when his men took heavy losses. Mao adopted a more cautious strategy and tried to minimize losses as much as possible. The communists also took much greater care of injured soldiers than the nationalists and made sure that their troops were well supplied on the battlefield. That boosted morale and made the troops much less likely to desert or defect. Something else that helped the communists win over the population is that they were very good at propaganda. They had underground networks in the major cities that distributed leaflets and published newspapers. Beijing had 3 printing presses that were run by communist-supporting students. The communists also used music to win people over to their cause. Their anthem was called "Unity is Strength," which was written during the war against Japan. "Unity is Strength" was inspired by the harsh treatment of peasants by their landlords. The song was co-opted by the communists, and they made heavy use of it throughout the Civil War. One of the most unusual ways that the communists propagandized the masses was through theatre. They organized mobile drama troupes that traveled extensively, performing plays that promoted communist values. Those performances were made very accessible to the common people, often using local dialects. They were intended, as ever, to stoke class war and make the peasants resentful of their landlords. You might be seeing a theme. The plays also portrayed the communist leaders as heroes, bravely resisting the fascist nationalists. As you can see, the communists were very good at winning the population over, and it helped them hugely during the war. Now let's talk about the nationalists. The nationalists were hopeless at winning over the population and alienated them at every turn. When Japan surrendered in August of 1945, Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists seemed to have all the popular support. Chiang Kai-shek personally was hugely famous. People viewed him as a hero that had led the resistance against Japan. However, being so tied to the war against Japan also had some downsides. It meant that the nationalists were viewed as responsible for everything that had gone wrong during the war. One particularly sore point was the decision that Chiang had made to deliberately cause a huge flood which devastated a massive area. In 1938, nationalist forces deliberately broke some of the dikes of the Yellow River and an enormous area was flooded. They did that because they hoped it would impede the Japanese invasion. Of course, the downsides of that decision were catastrophic. Nearly 500,000 Chinese civilians died and many millions were left homeless. It was an incredibly controversial and unpopular decision by Chiang. After the war was over, Chiang was faced with the difficult task of trying to redirect the river along its original course. In 1947, he tried to do just that. Unfortunately, they were unable to control the river, and again it ended up causing a huge amount of destruction. 500 villages were submerged, and 100,000 people were left homeless. Those people weren't given any compensation. It was another huge stain on the reputation of Chiang, and made people think that he didn't care about them. As you can see, for the nationalists, being in charge of governing the totally destroyed country was actually a very difficult position to be in. They had to decide how to try to rebuild the totally devastated country. China's situation at the time was dire. During the Japanese occupation, it had lost nearly 20 million people, almost 5% of its population. Millions were homeless, and almost all of the country's infrastructure was destroyed. In Shanghai, China's richest city, about half of the industrial capacity was destroyed. Across China as a whole, an astonishing 96% of all railway lines were destroyed. Agricultural production was well below pre-war levels, and the country was heavily indebted, mainly to the United States. The nationalists, as the government of China, were forced to take responsibility for that horrific situation. They had to make the very difficult political decisions about how to rebuild, and as is so often the case, making difficult decisions was extremely unpopular. They were forced to levy huge taxes on the population, increasing the tax burden by about 60%. Taxes were so high that people ended up hiding their goods in communist-controlled areas to avoid paying them. One of the biggest problems was inflation, which reached 230% per year. To try to combat that, Chiang decided to introduce a new currency called the gold yuan. The new currency was introduced at an exchange rate of 1 gold yuan for 3 million of the previous currency, and prices and wages were fixed to try to stop them from rising. Citizens were forced to exchange all their precious metals and foreign currencies for the new money. Unfortunately, that didn't stop the inflation. Very foolishly, the nationalists tried to fund their huge expenses by printing a lot of their new currency. Very quickly, there was hyperinflation, completely defeating the point of introducing the new currency in the first place. The government's set prices and wages also damaged the economy. Businesses were only able to sell at the prices set by the government, but their costs were soaring. Eventually, many of them were unable to operate and were forced to close. As you can see, the dire state of China would have required an incredibly competent government to improve the situation, and the nationalists were anything but that. From the poor economic policies to the bad decision to divert the Yellow River, they made many mistakes and it hurt their popularity. In fact, not only were they incompetent, they were also deeply corrupt. For decades, corruption had been a huge problem in the nationalist political party, the Kuomintang. In fact, as early as 1936, Chiang Kai-shek himself said that his party was, quote-unquote, weak and rotten, obsessed with ease and pleasure. He actually said that the reason that they couldn't defeat the communists was because of, quote-unquote, the inefficiency and corruption of our government machine. He knew that the situation needed to change, otherwise they would have no chance of defeating the communists. He said, if we do not weed out the present body of corruption, bribery, perfunctoriness, and ignorance, and establish instead a clean and efficient administration, the day will soon come when the revolution will be started against us. Unfortunately for Chiang, that corruption never was weeded out, and the abuses continued right through the Civil War. One thing that would happen was that party officials would require local businesses to prove that they hadn't collaborated with the Japanese during the occupation. What counted as collaboration was extremely broad. If someone had just operated a business in a Japanese-controlled area, that was enough. Those unable to provide proof that they hadn't collaborated had their businesses seized by the nationalist Kuomintang officials. The really corrupt part was that those same party officials who had seized the businesses would then resell it back to their original owners at full price, pocketing the difference. That kind of exploitation understandably enraged the population. The higher-ups in the nationalist leadership were also equally corrupt. For example, the head of Chiang's military council had 3 sons, all of whom were involved in dodgy dealings. One was a major opium producer, another ran a network of brothels, and a third operated casinos. Just in case being incompetent and corrupt wasn't enough to alienate the population, the nationalists were also quite brutal and violent. Those who criticized the government were attacked or arrested. In some cases, prominent opposition leaders would even be murdered. For example, during the winter of 1945 to 46, a Kuomintang mob killed several anti-war demonstrators in Kunming. Some of the strongest critics of the government were students and liberal intellectuals. There were constant strikes and protests. In fact, in 1946, in Shanghai alone, there were more than 1,700 strikes and labor disputes. Those strikes were often harshly repressed by the police. For example, one student demonstration in Nanjing in May of 1947 saw many people shot and hundreds beaten. Eventually, in 1948, Chiang decided to ban strikes altogether and increase the repression. In Shanghai, more than 3,000 suspects were arrested in just 2 months. Many of them were Shanghai's best-known businessmen accused of selling on the black market. There was also a lot of violence and brutality committed in the countryside. Often it was done by irregular forces that were fighting with the nationalist army. Anyone who was believed to have collaborated with the communists would be killed. As I said earlier, the communists were also extremely brutal and violent, which begs the question, why didn't they suffer the same loss of popularity from their brutality? Well, a big part of the answer is that they were targeting different groups. The nationalists attacked anyone who they suspected of having communist sympathies or even just having a dislike towards the government. That meant everyone, including businessmen, intellectuals, students, and workers. In contrast, the communist violence was primarily directed at a much smaller segment of the population, the rich landowners, and they were already widely resented by the majority. As you can see, the communists were much better than the nationalists at winning the support of the people, but the question remains, how exactly did that help them win the war? Well, the simplest and most obvious way is that it gave them more men to fight. At the beginning of the war, the nationalists had a huge advantage in manpower. They had about 4 million troops compared to the communists' 1 million. Only 3 years later, those numbers had changed dramatically. By 1948, the nationalists had only 2.5 million troops, slightly more than half of what they had before. The communist forces, on the other hand, had doubled to about 2 million. That was because far more people wanted to fight for the communists. Peasants who had heard of the communist land redistribution rushed to join them in order to receive some free land. The difference in popularity also meant that the communist troops had much better morale than those of the nationalists. In fact, an American report from May 1947 contrasted, quote-unquote, the fighting spirit of the communists with the exhaustion of the nationalists and their growing indignation over the disparity between officers' enrichment and soldiers' low pay, life, and their lack of interest in fighting far from home. That lack of morale within the nationalist ranks led to a very high rate of desertions and defections. For example, when the communists were laying siege to Changchun in Manchuria, some nationalist officers who were disappointed by government policies contacted the communists and offered to switch sides. They then gave the communists some valuable intelligence on the city's weak defenses. That played an important role in the eventual fall of the city. One big difference between the communists and the nationalists is that the communists welcomed deserters to their cause. In fact, they took very seriously the task of winning over wavering nationalist soldiers. They had special propaganda units solely focused on that. Pamphlets with simple messages were dropped over enemy lines. They said things like, "Brothers, lay down your arms, which you never wanted to take up. Did you join the Kuomintang army freely? No, you were dragged into it at the end of a rope. Come over to us. If you want, we will send you home. Better still, you can join us and fight to free your homes as we have ours." The communists didn't just use pamphlets. At the siege of Suzhou, they used loudspeakers to tell the defenders that they would be offered food and water if they switched sides. Many hungry soldiers and civilians did just that and were welcomed. Overall, the popularity of the communists and the unpopularity of the nationalists turned out to be a hugely significant factor in the course of the war. The second major reason that the war turned out the way it did is that there was a huge difference in how internally united the two sides were. The communists were totally united around one ideology and one figure, Mao Zedong. Mao had been the leader of the Communist Party since 1935 and had become a legendary, almost godlike figure. That was more than anything due to the epic, grueling retreat that he led in 1934, what became known as the Long March. Just to remind you, at that point the communists were surrounded and on the verge of being destroyed. They just about managed to escape the encirclement and embarked on an extremely long trek from one end of China to the other. Over the course of a year, they walked about 9,000 kilometers. Of the 70,000 communists that started the journey, only about 7,000 or 10% survived. That story became the stuff of legend for the communist forces. It was a tale of determination against all odds that inspired them. It was Mao's actions during the Long March that solidified his leadership over the communists. Over time, there developed a cult of personality around him, perhaps comparable to what Hitler had within the Nazi Party. That fanatical loyalty allowed Mao to make some very difficult and unpopular decisions. One example was his decision to make an alliance with the nationalists in 1936. I mentioned before that the two sides made an official alliance to resist the Japanese invasion. Well, that alliance was first proposed by Mao. It was a bitter pill to swallow. It was only 2 years since the communists had almost been wiped out by the nationalists and had to undergo the Long March. No doubt the communists couldn't have hated the nationalists more bitterly, and yet Mao made the decision to ally with them. That turned out to be a very good decision. First, it made the communists look like patriots. The vast majority of the public was most worried about the threat from Japan, so the fact that Mao was willing to put aside his differences with the nationalists in order to fight against the Japanese showed that he put China first. It also gave the communists time to recover. Since the nationalists were now allied with the communists, they couldn't attack them, which meant that throughout the war with Japan, the communists were able to regroup and recover. Don't forget that the war with Japan broke out only 3 years after the Long March, and so at that point, the communists were still incredibly weak. When the war against Japan ended in 1945, the Communist Party emerged much stronger. Another difficult and unpopular decision that Mao took was to abandon the communist capital, Yan'an, in 1947. Yan'an had been their base for over a decade, and so, understandably, they were reluctant to abandon it. Many party members and even some advisors from the Soviet Union warned that doing so would devastate the party's morale. Nevertheless, Mao had total control over his party, and so it was his decision to do so. That decision again paid off, and the communists were able to preserve their forces to fight at a more opportune moment. Those difficult decisions were possible all because the communists had such a fanatical loyalty to Mao. Their total unity around him turned out to be a huge advantage. Of course, to have so much power held by one man required that he make good decisions, and Mao, in large part, did. Considering that he was a fanatical communist ideologue, he could actually be quite pragmatic and flexible when it was needed. For example, at one point during the war, there was disagreement amongst the communists about whether the land confiscation and redistribution was helping or hurting their cause. Some Communist Party members worried that some of the most radical measures were actually alienating rural communities. Mao's response was to put a pause on some of the most extreme policies and only resume them after they won the war. Again, that turned out to be a good decision. As you can see, the fact that the communists were totally united around Mao was a great asset to them. Unfortunately for the nationalists, they were the complete opposite. They didn't enjoy anything like the same unity and cohesion. Chiang himself had far less power within the nationalists than Mao had within the communists. In reality, the nationalist leadership was a group of generals, and they often had different agendas. The nationalist generals would often defy Chiang and do what they thought best. Perhaps the best example of the power of the nationalist generals was the fact that they actually took Chiang hostage in 1936, just before the war with Japan. I mentioned earlier that the communists had proposed to ally with the nationalists to fight off the Japanese. Well, initially, Chiang hadn't wanted to do that. He wanted to focus on defeating the communists first and then fight the Japanese. Chiang's generals, on the other hand, did want to ally with the communists, and eventually they forced him to. In what was known as the Xi'an incident, Chiang's generals took him prisoner and forced him to agree to a formal alliance with the communists. As you can see, Chiang was far from having total power over his party. Throughout the Civil War, that badly hampered the nationalists. Some of the commanders were more interested in pursuing their own interests than in the nationalist cause. Rather than being one unified military, the nationalists were really a coalition of local factions that were badly integrated and didn't cooperate well together. A good example of that was in 1947, after Chiang's northern forces were decimated in the failed offensives in Manchuria. He desperately needed more men to fight, so he tried to summon armies from the south to fight in the north. However, those southern forces were under the control of local commanders who expected political rewards in return, such as powerful positions in the government or guarantees of future regional autonomy. At times, the nationalist commanders would just ignore orders and do whatever they wanted. For example, during the important Battle of Mukden, the capital of Manchuria, Chiang's commander there suddenly abandoned the city, totally without authorization. The city was left without leadership, making it inevitable that it would fall. Another betrayal was by the nationalist commander of Beijing just before it fell. He controlled an army of 350,000 men and could have sent them to fight off the communist offensive. Instead, he began secret negotiations with the communists. In the end, he switched sides and let the communists take Beijing. In return, he was given a ministerial position in the communist government after the war, a position he retained until 1972. As you can see, even the nationalist leadership didn't have that much commitment to their cause. There was a similar lack of commitment from the nationalist troops as well. Many of the men were more loyal to their own region and its leaders than to Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalist army. That meant that while they fought well in their home regions, they were less motivated and often defected when sent thousands of kilometers away. Another way in which disunity hurt the nationalists is that it meant that they were very easily infiltrated by communist spies. A good example of that was in 1947, just before the nationalists took the communist capital of Yan'an. If you remember, the communists were able to evacuate all their forces from the city before the nationalists arrived. They were able to do that because they knew that the nationalists were coming because they had a man on the inside. The general responsible for planning the attack on Yan'an had a personal secretary who was a communist spy. Through him, the Communist Party secured access to critical information and was able to evacuate 20,000 of its troops and key supplies 2 weeks before the attack. Had it not been for that successful intelligence operation, the nationalist victory at Yan'an might have been a decisive turning point in the war. As you can see, from the very beginning, the nationalists had a lot of internal division, and it actually got worse as the war went on. In fact, towards the end of the war, the nationalists basically fell apart. It was a total internal collapse. In early 1949, the nationalists had lost a lot of territory, but they did still control the majority of China. It should have been possible for them to keep fighting and at least hold the communists to a stalemate. Most historians believe that it would have been possible to stop the communists from crossing the Yangtze River into southern China. Crossing such a large body of water would have been difficult for the communists, particularly because they didn't have a navy. In the end, because the nationalists collapsed from within, they were unable to put up any resistance, and the communists were able to invade southern China. The collapse really started with the resignation of Chiang Kai-shek in January of 1949. It's not totally clear why Chiang did that or what was going through his mind. In the previous months, there had been several major defeats, and the nationalists had lost a huge amount of territory. It might have been that he simply didn't want to be the man to lead the nationalists to defeat. Another possibility is that he thought the best course of action was to negotiate with the communists and knew that he wasn't the right person to do that. Whatever the reason, on January the 21st, Chiang resigned and named his successor as his vice president, Lee Zhong-ren. However, many hardline members of the party didn't want Lee Zhong-ren to be leader, at least not in the long term. What they wanted was for Lee to agree a ceasefire with the communists, which would allow them some time to recover. Then, once they were in a stronger position, they wanted Chiang to return and they would continue fighting. That was probably what Chiang had in mind as well. Many times in the past, he had resigned only to return, and he was probably planning on doing that again. In fact, he never actually had Lee named official president. His title was acting president. Also, Chiang remained head of the party. He even wrote Lee's first statement as acting president. Lee himself didn't totally know what was going on. He only found out that he wasn't officially named as president when he went to the presidential palace and found out that his title was acting president. That convoluted, clandestine plan led to chaos at the top of the Kuomintang. It was a leadership crisis, and there was a lot of confusion about who was truly in charge. For 3 months, there was this strange situation with Lee as president on paper, but Chiang wielding a lot of influence behind the scenes. Some of Chiang's actions were actually incredibly damaging to Lee's government. In February, without consulting Lee, he decided to transfer all their gold reserves to Taiwan. That left Lee without any money to fund his government. During that time, Lee was trying to negotiate with the communists, but Mao rejected anything other than an unconditional surrender. Overall, the resignation of Chiang was one of the most important events in the war and led the nationalists to totally collapse. Chiang had been their leader for 20 years. He was absolutely indispensable, the glue that held them together. Many nationalist leaders were loyal to Chiang personally and didn't want to work with the new government led by Lee. For example, the Prime Minister refused to recognize the new president and took his entire cabinet to Guangzhou. That effectively split the nationalist government in two. There was a similar situation on the battlefield. Many of the commanders were loyal only to Chiang and weren't willing to take orders from Lee's government. The problem was made worse by the fact that Chiang was continuing to give orders to the military, and often they actually contradicted the orders of Lee's government. Lee wanted to mount a defense of Nanjing, the capital, but Chiang thought that that was a lost cause. He told the military to abandon Nanjing and focus on defending Shanghai. As you can see, it was total chaos. The nationalists were in absolutely no position to fight a war. Eventually, the nationalist navy that was tasked with defending the Yangtze River defected to the communists. That removed the last obstacle to the communists crossing the river and invading southern China. In April, Nanjing, the nationalist capital, fell, and with that the war was effectively over. I think those two factors are the two most important reasons why the communists won the Chinese Civil War, but there is something else worth mentioning. That is the role of foreign powers in the war, the Soviet Union and the United States. I've said repeatedly in the video that the nationalists started the war with some big advantages, and one of the biggest was that they had the backing of the USA. So what happened with that? Why didn't that stop them from losing the war? Well, essentially, throughout the war, the US stopped helping the nationalists. Initially, in 1946, when the Civil War restarted, the US was giving a lot of support to the nationalists. One of the biggest things that it did was to ensure that the nationalists took control of as much of China as possible after the end of World War II. The Americans helped transport nationalist troops to the former Japanese-occupied territories to prevent them from going to the communists. Even after that, the Americans continued to give a lot of support. They helped train the nationalist forces and gave them over $1 billion in loans. However, what the Americans wanted was for Chiang Kai-shek to make peace with the communists. They didn't want to fund and support a full-on civil war. They feared that a prolonged war would only increase Soviet influence in China. The American envoy to China was General George Marshall. He was willing to keep sending American aid to China, but only if Chiang made a coalition government with the communists. Chiang had other ideas. He wasn't willing to do a deal, and so those early negotiations quickly broke down. In fact, Chiang was already planning his first offensive against the communists in Manchuria. Chiang was happy to go against the wishes of the Americans because he incorrectly thought that their help was guaranteed. He didn't think that there was any risk that they would stop supporting him. He thought that the US was so committed to stopping the spread of communism that they would support him whatever he did. That would prove to be a grave mistake. In September of 1946, the US imposed an arms embargo on China, almost totally ending its support for the nationalists. Over the next few months, the relationship between Chiang and the Americans began to break down. During one meeting with Marshall in December of 1946, tensions flared. Marshall blamed nationalist hardliners for sabotaging the peace process and undermining US efforts to help. Chiang refused to accept any responsibility, instead accusing Marshall of being deceived by the communists. Relations continued to get worse over the next few months. In January of 1947, Marshall became Secretary of State in the US, which was a big increase in his power. That was bad news for Chiang, as he now had a powerful adversary within the US government. In fact, Chiang became so unpopular with the Americans that they actually considered trying to get rid of him and taking more direct control of the situation. That never happened, and in the end, the Americans just withdrew their support. In May of 1947, they reneged on a promise to send Chiang a desperately needed loan of $500 million. Perhaps at that point Chiang was beginning to get the message, but it was too late. The relationship with the Americans was irreparably damaged, and there was no longer any real chance of substantial American help. That lack of American support definitely did play a role in why the communists won the Civil War. However, the reason I wouldn't name it as one of the major factors is that the communists also didn't get much support from their would-be backer, the Soviet Union. Stalin, the Soviet leader, didn't help Mao that much for the somewhat ironic reason that he actually thought that China wasn't ready to create a communist society. According to Marxist-Leninist theory, a country first had to industrialize before it was ready to become communist. Stalin wanted the communists to first cooperate with the nationalists, create an industrial state with a solid workers' base, and only then become fully communist. That said, the Soviets did help Mao a bit. The most important thing that they did was right at the beginning of the war, when they allowed the communists to take control of Manchuria as they withdrew. That allowed the communists to seize all the Japanese military equipment that had been left behind, including 700 tanks, 900 aircraft, 800,000 rifles, and 14,000 machine guns. It also gave them their main base of operations from which they would conduct the rest of the war. Throughout the rest of the war, the Soviets continued to give a bit of support, but it really wasn't a great deal. They sent a few hundred military experts to advise and supplied some basic equipment such as boots, helmets, and ammunition. However, they didn't send troops, money, or equipment like tanks or planes. It was far less than they could have sent, and the communists were disappointed with the lack of support. Overall, given that both sides didn't receive a huge amount of external support, I don't think it can be seen as a major factor in why the war turned out the way it did. I think the two most important things to focus on are the two things that I've spent most of the video talking about: the difference in popularity between the two sides and the difference in unity. The war was incredibly bloody, with between 3 and 6 million casualties. It was also incredibly important in the modern world. It is the reason that relations between China and the West are so bad, and also the reason that China is constantly threatening to invade Taiwan. It was also important because of the state that was created in its aftermath. Mao and the communists were absolutely fanatical in their determination to implement communism as thoroughly as possible. Their land reforms would go on to cause the biggest famine in human history, killing about 50 million people. A few years later, there was what was known as the Cultural Revolution, which was essentially a country-wide purge of anyone that didn't believe in the system. Millions were killed, and many more were subjected to violence or humiliation in so-called struggle sessions. In contrast, Taiwan has become a democracy with multi-party elections and freedom of speech guaranteed in its constitution. It has independent courts, property rights, and the rule of law. It is the polar opposite of mainland China, ruled by the totalitarian CCP. We can only imagine how the modern world might look now if it was Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists that won the Civil War.
Thanks again to War Thunder for sponsoring today's video. Make sure to check out War Thunder now for free on PC, PlayStation, Xbox, or on mobile, and use my links in the pinned comment to register. Those of you who are new or who haven't played in 6 months will also receive a massive bonus pack across PC and console, including multiple premium vehicles, in-game currency, and more.